страшних ворогів і рахуючи гроші, сміялися їх хитно. Ну і хто тебе кликав?
Welcome to Geopolitics Decanted. I'm Dmitri Alperovitch, chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, a geopolitics think tank in Washington, D.C. And today I have a great podcast for you with my friends, Michael Kofman, a senior fellow now at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Rob Lee, senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and Andrey Liscovich, who runs the Ukraine Defense Fund, a charity that is doing some really amazing work providing non-lethal equipment to Ukrainian troops. I would highly, highly encourage you to donate to this incredible charity, ukrainedefensefund.org. If you're willing, every single dollar goes directly to the equipment, to the troops, no overhead, and it's really directly contributing to their success and saving lives at the front line. So welcome to the show, guys.
Greetings.
All right. Thanks for having us.
Hey, thanks for having us.
All right. So, Mike, Rob, you just recently got back from Ukraine, and Andrey, you're spending most of your time there. What I wanted to talk about today is this evolution in drone warfare, and particularly FPV drones. And I know you guys have a piece coming out on this very topic in terms of Mike and Rob. So, Mike, maybe we can start with you. We've talked a lot over the last year about the artillery shortages, the ammo shortages that Ukrainians are experiencing, which are about to get even more acute as they're receiving probably several million shells from North Korea and ramping up their own production in Russia. To what extent do you see FPVs as an alternative to artillery and an ability to at least at some level compensate for those shell shortages that the Ukrainians will experience undoubtedly over the next year because the Western production is not keeping up? And what have you observed at the front in terms of how they're being used and the evolution of that technology? Let's start with you, Mike.
Okay, sure. So let me try to paint the picture and then hand it over a bit to Rob. So I don't see them as an alternative because they can't fill the roles of artillery, but I see them as a very useful offset. And they can lead to good tactical and doctrinal adaptation because with drones like FPVs, you can use them defensively to take out armored fighting vehicles, to take out infantry. You can use them in support of offensive operations. Drone munitions come in a wide variety, and they're typically modified by the people who assemble these. But drones have come to steadily take over the battlefield at the tactical level at around the 10 to 15 kilometer range, not in substitution to the other capabilities we often discuss, like minefields, anti-tank guided missiles, tanks, helicopters, but in addition to them. And what they've done is they make it very difficult to operate at daytime with vehicles, right, within a certain range of the front line. Now, that being said, FPVs and typical drones used have their own limitations. First, difficult to use in mass. They interfere with each other's signals, and that's something that's not been broken through yet. So when people think, I can substitute volume of fire with volume of drones, the answer is the technology is maturing. Maybe you will be able to, but you can't do that yet, right? Second, drones negate terrain. No, they don't. Terrain does matter. You need other drones to retransmit a signal to get range on your drone. The side that has the high ground has advantage in signal propagation and transmission to the drones as well. It still matters. Next, these drones have revolutionized warfare. I always get heartburn whenever I hear the word revolutionize. I prefer the word it's led to an evolution. And the technology is still maturing. Nobody using the drone says we don't need artillery anymore, but you increasingly see that the drones can be used to deny certain types of capabilities, certain types of mobilities within a range, and offset the requirement for high volume deployment of artillery. That said, there's a whole range of views on how effective drones are. That is, what percentage of missions of drones are successful. And it requires training. It requires a lot of operators to use, so it's not quite that simple and easy. And two final points. I'll turn over to Rob. The first is, to use drones, you have to scale the production of actual drone systems, and the training of drone operators and skill really matters. Second, you still need drone munitions. And here Ukraine has a deficit, although one that I think is far easier to plug, right? The folks that think, hey, we can just substitute main caliber artillery types for drone munitions. Okay, that might be easier if Ukraine actually was flush with the munitions for drones, but there are two light challenges and issues. All right, and maybe say some thoughts for Rob on this.
Yeah, Rob, so talk about what you've seen in terms of how those FPVs, these are the first-person view drones where you're looking directly as you're flying them, and you can do that at much greater speeds and more accurately. how they're used at the front. I know you have some interesting stories from the CP, the command post that you visited, both in terms of ISR, the intelligence on the collection on the battlefield, and in terms of actual use for destruction.
So I guess one of the things I'd emphasize is that we were there in July, and then we came back in November. And July, Ukraine faced a variety of threats to the Russian side, right? A variety of anti-tank capabilities that made it difficult to mass armor. But by November, FPVs were the main threat, right? So maybe before it was artillery, maybe it was ATGMs or a variety of things. FPVs is the thing they emphasized. We got there in November. And in some parts of the front, as Mike was saying, it completely affects their tactics, right? So they'll operate first thing in the morning at dawn, which is like a traditional thing people do in warfare. Like, this is true of the French and Indian War. But they'd operate things FPVs. The cameras weren't as effective right at dawn, but you could still kind of see. And it was, you have a brief amount of time you could operate. And some Ukrainian units would drop off their assault groups. They basically drive them up to our vehicles, drop them off the first line of trenches, and then the vehicles would leave. The vehicles would be gone for the whole day, and they're expected to try to hold that trench, right, for the entire day. And so Russia will do counterattacks, and it becomes this kind of FPV battle where, on one hand, Russia will try to counterattack with its own forces. If Ukraine has enough FPVs, that might be sufficient to help, to hold this first line of trenches that you took that morning. But at the same time, Russia's going to try and knock these guys out of the trench with FPVs too. And as Mike was saying, FPVs are useful. They have some advantages over artillery. They have some disadvantages. An advantage is you can fly right into a trench, right? You can fly right into a dugout. That means you can hit, cover concealed positions more effectively than artillery typically. But of course, EW is a significant problem due with FPVs. And Russia is now expanding its use of tactical EW, like trench EW for individual like platoon positions. They're putting EW systems on tanks. We're actually seeing some of these old RCID jammers they use in Syria. We're now seeing them be applied back onto armored vehicles again. Most likely they're trying to repurpose them to fill a kind of counter FPV role. I know we're doing the same thing, so it wouldn't be surprising if they are. And so, depending in some places, FPVs are a kind of dominant thing. But it's important to keep in mind, Ukraine mostly is doing kind of small scale attacks, right? And so we say that FPVs are a big problem for that. Well, if they're doing a brigade level operation, FPVs, because as Mike mentioned, right, it's each team is operating one at a time. You have to have a different team operating, a retransmitter UAV, a different team operating a Mavic to try and provide, ISR for the FPVs. So it's not as though it's a small, group doing this. It's a large kind of number of UAV operators kind of operating. And weather's a big factor, right? If it's foggy, if it's overcast, FPVs are not that effective. That affects operations again, right? Sometimes if the weather is quite overcast for a few days, that may affect when you do operations, when you do assaults, when you defend, how you do so, right? So all these things.
So you almost want to launch operations in terrible weather, right?
Yeah, it sometimes yes, right? It depends where the advantage is. But it's interesting with FPVs, and there's a lot more we'll talk about kind of in the future about this. But it's also interesting is how FPV units are being kind of the supporting relationships with infantry units, right? So they're often put it into kind of direct support of a assault that's going on, and so you'll have maybe an ISR UAV platoon that'll be providing kind of surveillance, intelligence, reconnaissance, right, through those UAV feeds. Company commanders, battalion commanders for infantry units will command their troops, right? They'll see what's happening. They'll communicate that to the guys on front line. And then you'll also FPV units sometimes put in direct support of these units. And you'll have different FPV teams. Some of them will be tasked with hitting, say, the trench that's being assaulted, right? So they'll have them before the actual assault occurs. A little bit kind of how like artillery is put in direct support attached to infantry units. And then you'll also different FPV team often put in tasked with kind of preventing counterattacks. So it's interesting. It's not just attacks being developed, but also kind of how they're being employed. The structure is different. So different Ukrainian brigades have different structural breakdowns to these units. But ultimately, a lot of this is quantity issue, right? It's numbers game, and then we're in a phase of very fast technological development. And so with anything in warfare, right, there's always an offense-defense balance, right? When you develop some new offensive capability, then there'll be a defensive kind of countermeasure that comes up, and then you have an offensive countermeasure. That process goes on continuously. We're seeing that right now. And as a question, it is to me, is we've seen FPVs become very effective this summer. There's a question, will EW make kind of strides in the next few months? Because there's this really significant demand for that. It will, I've no doubt when Mike and I go back, next time, that the nature of the FPV fight will be different, right? And I'd say one way it's already being different is that up until now, FPVs were not operating that much at nighttime. We are now increasingly seeing FPVs set up with thermal cameras, right? There's some very cheap, Chinese thermal cameras, only a couple $100s. And so we're already seeing that as a problem. I know in Avdiivka and elsewhere, where the Russians are using thermal FPVs. And that makes it quite difficult because up until now, Ukraine could only kind of resupply certain frontline areas at nighttime, right, to get around the FPV threat. If FPVs with thermal cameras are, a kind of persistent threat going on, and there's no countermeasure to it, that could make it much more difficult for Ukraine to hold some of these positions. Because in a lot of cases, to get up to the front line, right behind your own line, you have to, in many cases, they have to hike maybe 5-6 kilometers to do so, or they use vehicles very sparingly to do so.
And Rob, talk a little bit about the munition piece as well, because most people don't appreciate that there's, Mike mentioned that there's a supply chain issue for these RPG rounds that are typically used, but the RPG rounds are designed to be shot from a rocket that flies really, really fast, right? So the fuses probably need to be modified for an FPV drone to make it more useful. And you also have this very bulky thing hanging off the drone that affects its aerodynamics and affects, obviously, its battery life, etc. So you're probably going to see innovations in how you integrate explosives into the structure of these FPV drones going forward, as opposed to jerry-rigging them with these RPG rounds, right?
Yeah, and look, I think the overall point, right, and this is certainly true right now, but true over the entire war, is that Ukraine's never had enough ammunition, right? Never had enough artillery ammunition, mortar ammunition, tank ammunition, and so they always compensate in different ways, right? We started using tanks in a kind of indirect fire role to make up for this lack of artillery ammunition. Well, they're doing that with FPVs now. And the munitions they use whatever they have, right? And so initially they're using a lot of RPG munitions. RPG munitions are good enough in that they're relatively cheap. And if you hit a tank from the top or the rear, you can reliably penetrate armor in many cases. But right, RPG munitions, the nature of them, you have to break the kind of like the frontal cone. I forgot what it's called. And if you don't break it properly, the RPG will not detonate properly. And so I remember when I was training the Georgians, I saw them fire a lot of RPG-7 rounds. And if you hit the side of a hill, but the angle isn't right, it won't detonate. It'll just keep kind of going. And so a lot of times you see FPVs, they'll hit a target and the munition won't necessarily function properly. And you said RPGs, are flying faster than FPVs typically are when they hit a target. In another case, a lot of times the FPVs using, against armor sometimes it's infantry. Well, a RPG round that is designed for penetrate tank is not ideal for hitting, infantry, right? There's not enough frag. So they're adapting in a variety of ways. They are making some specialized kind of munitions. Some of these are, right, they're using kind of RPG munitions. Sometimes they're using other kind of high explosive kind of submunitions, anti-tank grenades. But they're also developing thermobaric kind of munitions, their own kind of, bespoke kind of HE with more fragmentation. But you said, though, that the big problem is the lack of standardization, right? So on one hand, making these munitions is very dangerous. So a lot of people get killed, lose their fingers, other things like that. Because literally, we're talking about these things being built in apartments or in the front line or elsewhere. It's a dangerous job. A lot of cases, the FPV you might have can only carry so much weight. So they have to kind of like shave down an RPG munition so it gets within the weight tolerance. As you said, right, it's a lot of this comes down to the skill of the pilot. Well, the skill of the pilot is much more difficult if every time they're operating FPV, it's a little different materials. Also, the munition they're flying has a different kind of weight, aerodynamics, so on. All of that affects these kind of things, right? And so I posted a video yesterday that shows it was a Russian tank, and something like 5 or 6 Ukrainian FPVs go after while driving. 2 of them hit, but don't penetrate the tank, and then 3 of them miss, right, while it's driving at full speed. It just comes back to as I said before, FPVs are a way of partially compensating for lack of artillery ammunition, but it's not a full thing, right? It can't perform the full kind of range of missions that artillery can. And in a lot of cases, in terms of tanks, right, there was the Ukraine's 93rd Mechanized Brigade had their UAV unit posted a kind of infographic the other day about the losses they inflicted over the previous month, and showed they hit 17 tanks, none of which were destroyed. Right, so whereas they're destroying, BMPs, BTRs, other vehicles, but tanks are just not reliably penetrating them. So it's again something to keep in mind. We go back to tanks. Passive armor on tanks is still very useful because you're not always going to penetrate these things, and a lot of times you get this kind of false sense of how vulnerable these things are. So again, FPVs, they are extremely important. The munition issue is significant. The munition shortage is a big issue. I think that's one way that Western countries can help Ukraine is let Ukraine produce FPVs maybe themselves, and then try and come up with munitions, either RPG munitions they're already using, so maybe Bulgaria can produce more, or maybe there's other kind of munitions we can make that are bespoke for FPVs that can make them more efficient for different kind of missions.
So I guess one lesson here is that tank is not yet obsolete either, right? Andrey, let's bring you in. Rob mentioned electronic warfare, EW. That is a huge issue for both sides, right? Interfering with these drones, causing a lot of the losses of those drones. We've talked to you before when we were on the train back from Kiev about both friendly fire issues and EW issues. Talk about some of the compensating technologies that are being used now to counter the EW threat and how the Ukrainians are in particular thinking about it.
EW remains a major problem along the front. It's a continual cat and mouse game. With FPV specifically, the first iteration of this game had to do with trying to interfere with telemetry, which is generally on frequencies between 860 and 930 megahertz. So that band is getting jammed quite comprehensively in many areas. Usually a different band is used for video transmission, something like 5.8 gigahertz. And the primary challenge right now is on the telemetry. So the idea is that you're trying to make sure that the drone cannot be operated. Then even if the video is still intact, the drone becomes much less of a threat. It still means that if this occurs right next to the target, the drone may still hit the target if it's properly positioned, even if it's not too far from this target. These trench-based EW devices, they generally have a range of a few dozen meters, like 50 to 100 meters.
These are handhelds, right? These are not the big trucks that they have for EW.
They're in between. They may be they're a bit too big to carry for an individual person, but it can be mounted on a vehicle. They could be placed in a trench, and they need to be powered by battery, and oftentimes they're not on 24/7. And so you kind of need to know that there's a threat to turn them on, and if it's the first strike, you may miss it. So right now, it's not clear that there's an impenetrable wall of EW interference on these frequencies. Is still fairly high among the experienced groups. Fairly high hit rate. I mean, they generally do something sophisticated, trying to understand if there is a large jammer using spectrum analyzer. If it's a small, less powered jammer, they obviously won't see it from a distance, but they would try to fly over with, say, a Mavic or something else, and we try to see if on a 5.8 gigahertz there is some interference. So they try to kind of explore the EW environment before they send the FPV to hit the target. And in that process, so the countermeasures to the countermeasure right now is people are trying to switch telemetry to different frequencies. There's a number of attempts to move down to 825 and below. That requires changing the hardware. You need a different antenna, and you need to update the firmware. So that work needs to happen locally. And this is one of those things that they need to constantly iterate on, because if everyone moves in mass to a different frequency, the other side will just adjust their interference to that band.
And they're not yet
one
using
thing that's
kind of software-defined radios where they can adjust that on the fly. I assume that's too expensive.
It's a challenging question, because you cannot jam all frequencies all the time, right? And the time that you have to react to an FPV once it's close enough is very limited. I mean, the entire flight path from the launch point to the target is a few minutes, 4 or 5 minutes, and the target get hit. The question here is how does one maintain good enough signal for enough of a flight path to actually hit the target? And it doesn't require that there's no interference at all. You just need to, you need it to be good enough. And then there is this entire difference between analog and digital signals. They are relying on analog signals quite extensively, because the jamming there results in a poor quality image, but you can still see the outline of the target. So you have this partial degradation rather than something that would happen in a digital context where it looks much more binary. So that effort is ongoing, and trying to switch frequencies and trying to also solve the problem of concentration. So one of the things that Rob and Mike mentioned, this problem with amassing a lot of them in one location. So the latest numbers I've heard is that on a kilometer of a front, they can currently operate about 20 drones at once. So if they fly out in diverging patterns in 140, 180 degrees, they can accommodate low double-digit number of these FPV drones, which is not too small. And then if they were to disperse the video and move the video from 5.8 to other frequencies, 4.8, 3.3, they can correspondingly increase the size. The other thing to keep in mind is that this problem of interference has been solved in the commercial setting. I mean, you can imagine a rally where there's 1,000 people, everyone has a cell phone, and they can still use a cell phone. So it's clearly not some insurmountable challenge. You just need to manage your spectrum wisely. The question is, can you do it at a price point that still keeps the FPV in this cost-effective range? The systems that are used by the military for this, the price point starts in mid 4 digits, so these are not consumer devices. And using military-grade systems today would completely make the entire device cost prohibitive. But again, the question is, how do we piggyback on consumer technology that has solved this problem for, say, cell phones and just operate it in a different frequency band?
So, Mike, there's a lot of commentary on social media and elsewhere that these things are changing the battlefield, particularly from an ISR perspective, that there's no hiding anymore. Everything is visible. You can't advance. Talk a little bit about the strategic impact on warfare, both in this context and more generally. Like, is this really changing everything, or is this just, one of those adaptations that is going to be a reaction to other things that are happening on the battlefield, and there's inevitably going to be counters to that as well from an infantry assault perspective?
Sure. So let me tell you how I think about it. So first, in my profession, it's very common to have two types of voices, right? There's sort of the futurist, this is changing everything voices, that whenever a new technology emerges, starts to be successful on the battlefield, and is used at scale, it feels like this is revolutionizing the fight, right? There are also more conservative voices. I tend to be analytically on the more conservative side that sees things as being an evolution, and then they will drive tactical adaptation. But what you're looking for is a lot more than just that. You're looking for changes in operational concepts, in organizational capacity, force structure, real changes to how a force fights and things at that scale. So the way I look at it is definitely leading to changes in tactics. And one of the biggest things that you've seen, at least in this specific war, is that it has led to a dispersal of forces and has made it rather hard to aggregate, both on the offense and the defense. People may assume that, drones might inherently enable the defense, but that's not necessarily the case, because you see troops trying to hold down terrain or a trench line, and it's a very small size unit element there because they don't want to just subject themselves to fires, right, to attrition. So you don't see forces concentrating on the defense. You don't see them concentrating on the offense either. That's why the fight has gone down from companies to platoons to small assault groups of somewhere size between maybe 11 to 16 men.
So let me just ask you this, because we've heard about this, we've discussed this on this podcast, that the platoon-style assaults have been one of the problems for this offensive that the Ukrainians have been launching since June, right? But you're saying that the FPVs are a contributing factor to the reason why they're assaulting in these small groups, not just the insufficient training that prevents them from doing large-scale combined arms assault.
Yeah, I think the FPVs are definitely a contributing factor, and the fact that it's much harder to mass and to employ force on a larger scale when you have FPVs and you don't have great solutions to it. But keep in mind a few things. First, we see, for example, in the Russian attack at Avdiivka, basically battalion-sized formations operating. And the reason they were trying to do that, even though they weren't successful, couldn't achieve a breakthrough, it wasn't just FPVs. It's because they didn't have the enablers to break through minefields. They had to deal with anti-tank guided missiles on top of FPVs, right? And they had a host of issues, the combination of problems and challenges they could not resolve. And the fact that terrain and minefields do their job. They canalize advancing vehicles and formations and make them then vulnerable to things like FPVs. All right, that said, look, EW is emerging as a counter. EW has now, as we just discussed, proliferated and has become much smaller and more man-portable. We now see EW systems appearing on Russian vehicles of different types, and EW is going to become cheaper and more widespread. So we see adaptations to FPVs as well. And so what's happening is you always have a technology that maybe denies the ability to maneuver, and then you'll have people trying to find adaptations to it. What I would suggest as a way of looking at this is futurists and the people who sort of glob onto any technology that emerges have a point. And often we need to correctly say that this technology may not be fully mature yet, right? We're looking at the World War I version of the aircraft, let's say, and we do not yet fully know how FPVs will impact the battlefield, because each time we come back, for example, we go back to Ukraine, Rob and I, We go every 3 months. We see an evolution, how the fight's being run. We see technologies being used better or differently than they were used before. And that is a very honest admission that this technology may not fully mature yet. Interference problems will be resolved. Terminal guidance problems will be resolved with the help of machine learning technologies. All sorts of other issues can be resolved on these systems. Okay, on the other hand, where I think the futurists tend to go a bit awry is they usually make their case, Dmitri, at the peak of when the technology is first emerged and starts to appear at scale, not before they see the adaptations and counters emerge to that technology, right? And so they forget that war at the end of the day is like a human phenomenon. It's a socio-political phenomenon. That's a contest of wills. It's not just about the technology. The capabilities and the technology are one piece of the puzzle. They're an aspect of warfare, and they want to focus on that aspect, right? But at the end of the day, when the technology is introduced, it drives adaptations, it drives counters to it, and it drives the use of similar such technologies to negate it as well. So we don't know how this will all shake out, but I'm just trying to moderate that conversation when people say, oh, tanks are obsolete, artillery is obsolete, and then they look at infantry casualties and they'll say infantry is obsolete too. I guess we should just sit in command posts and fight with drones with Wi-Fi mass, and that should be the future of warfare. And of course, it won't be, because drones don't control terrain. They don't take terrain, right? There's a whole host of things that drones can't do. So we just need to moderate that conversation.
Rob, talk a little bit about the ISR component of this. Again, everyone focuses on the kamikaze drones that destroy armored vehicles, as you've discussed, but the ability to see large parts of the front in real time by battalion commanders and brigade commanders and see all those drones is really, really powerful. And particularly in this context where the Ukrainian forces may not have real-time access to satellite maps and the like that you might have from a U.S. force that's doing ground operations where they would have air cover, air surveillance assets, etc. But in Ukraine, that is a big differentiator, presumably for both sides, Russia and Ukraine, because of the widespread use of ISR. So talk a little bit about what you've seen there.
Sure. So one of the things that's quite interesting to see is that in any part of the front right now, Ukraine will probably have dozens of UAVs up at any one time, right? Or Russia is the same thing. But all the command posts on that part of the front can see the feeds from these UAVs, right? And so it's not just your unit has access to UAVs and you can see that feed. You can also see the feeds of your adjacent units. Artillery units can see the feeds of infantry units, and so it significantly improves situational awareness for various commanders. And it's really useful in that regard. And because you have so many UAVs up too, anytime Russian position is spotted, you'll have multiple UAVs looking at from different directions. That also kind of helps have a better idea of situational awareness. Look, one of the big issues is that it's not just the kind of gray zone between the front trenches of both sides. UAVs can see well beyond the front line, and so if you ever want to mass armor or mass forces, it becomes very difficult. It's very difficult to do that and achieve surprise. It's very difficult to we in military we have a term called assembly areas, which is where you want to kind of form up your units before you go into attack. Well, those things have to be farther back now because you can identify things at greater range. And of course, as UAVs get better and cameras get better, right, that's going to be even more and more a bigger problem. So it is very difficult. One thing Mike was saying, we talk about the role of UAVs. I don't think UAVs have made anything obsolete. I think they've kind of adjusted the nature of warfare. But all the traditional capabilities are still important, right? So there's a lot of focus on tanks about UAVs, but UAVs have made it much more difficult to be an infantryman too, right? Because at nighttime you'll see infantrymen like a squad trying to maneuver somewhere, and a Mavic 3T, right, with a thermal camera, it's only costs like $5,000, not expensive, can see these guys at multiple kilometers away. Get very easy to identify them, especially when it's winter, right? Especially now when it's so cold, the difference between the body temperature. And so, you often see at nighttime UAVs spotting up, squads or smaller units and being able to either be used to call an artillery or drop munitions on them themselves, right? And that really changes a lot of what we do. Both sides have adapted by using counterthermal, right? They use different kind of bodysuits to try and limit their thermal signature, but all these things are really important. And I think the big point, and I agree with Mike on this, we're in a phase of rapid adaptation. It's not fully clear where this ends up, right? I mean, the EW is going to try and respond to a lot of these things. Look, some of these adaptations are very simple, right? I mean, at the beginning of the war, Russia had a lot of these kind of cages they put on their tanks, which people call cope cages, even though I thought they actually make some sense. Those went away after the first few months because they didn't stop, TB2 or Javelin rounds. But then when Mavics dropping munitions or FPVs came back, now both sides, use screens all over the place, right? And some of these are just adapted RPG screens. Well, now that FPV is using RPGs, the same screen kind of makes sense to defend against your vehicle, and a lot of times they're effective. And so, they're very rudimentary kind of adaptations that can be effective because, yes, it's not a 100% solution, but if it, protects you 20% of the time, that's still an important thing to kind of change. I think we're in this interesting moment where we're seeing the role of UAVs, how it's changing. It changes every season, right? It on both sides. Often Ukraine kind of adapts first, then Russia kind of copies that. But where does it shake out? It's not fully clear to me. But I think one other thing is keep in mind, and Andrey mentioned this, when we talk about EW and UAVs, they emit signals, and ultimately signals can be picked up, and that might be another form of kind of adaptation. The Russians use EW systems to pick up on cell phone signals, and they'll often use that to ping for glided bomb strikes or artillery strikes or whatever. Well, it's certainly possible that there may be developments where they can kind of try and pick up on UAV signals and try and more effectively locate where UAV operators are, which can make them a better, greater target too. And both sides are going after FPV teams so they can find them because they know they're an important kind of target here. So I think there are a lot of ways we're going to see changes happen. I think we should maybe mostly come to kind of tentative conclusions about the nature of changes to warfare. Although I agree, I think ultimately. It is much harder to hide now than it used to be, at nighttime, at daytime, so on. And a lot of this comes down to the fact that commercial technology has progressed a lot and has gotten a lot cheaper. And that's really the big difference here is that it's not just military domain, it's now a commercial domain. And I think the big thing I'd emphasize to U.S. or NATO military audiences is that any adversary we fight in the future will have these things, right? They're going to have Mavics, they'll have FPVs, because it's easy to buy if you were a small terrorist group. It's easy to buy if you were a state actor, right? So I think we have to have a plan to kind of prepare for this. We got to learn from the Ukrainians because they're dealing with this threat right now.
And presumably, you can not only use signal tracking to go after the UAV operators, but you can also use these FPVs to locate signals from jammers as well, and sort of build your poor man harms missiles that can destroy the sources of the jamming. Obviously, you have to be much more accurate than you can probably do today with the auto targeting there, but it's probably coming, right?
And another issue, I'm not the tech guy. Andrey, I think, knows this much better than I do. But with the retransmitter UAVs, so obviously FPVs operate with line of sight, and so kind of like radios in that regard, where if you're operating on the other side of the hill, radios often don't operate properly. FPVs, same thing. So you use retransmitter UAVs to extend the range and make it more effective and improve terminal guidance. Well, retransmitter UAVs have to be fly higher, right? As a result, that means they're more susceptible to wind changes, right? To other issues. And if both sides start taking out retransmitting UAVs, that will make FPVs much less effective. That will limit their range, right? There are a lot of kind of things that could change here. The same thing with that, retransmitter UAVs. You could probably automate some of those functions. So there are a lot of different places in this kill chain, right, with FPVs, where if you can target one countermeasure, you can make them less effective, or if you improve AI or targeting, whatever, you can make them more effective. And my view is I'm not a tech savvy guy, so I don't know exactly how it's going to kind of shake out here. But it's clear that what we're seeing right now is going to be different. It's not going to be the same way in a few months. Next year, it could be quite different.
And Andrey, let's bring you in here on this point specifically. You are seeing these adaptations where not only they're using these repeater drones, they're using mothership drones, right, that can take off with a bunch of FPV drones, deploy them to a location, and then they fly from there. So talk about some of those adaptations that Rob mentioned.
So the first point on the HARM missiles analogs that would target the jammers, in many ways that's a cost-benefit struggle, because the cheapest trench EW device that blocks out telemetry costs under $2,000. So if you hit it, it's not that hard to replace. And with that device, you can separate an antenna from the device itself and just separate them by quite significant distance. So the fact that you would take out an antenna would add $100 in cost to repair. So for some of these trench-based things, it's really challenging to take them out with cheap FPVs or cheap harm analogs. And of course, you would not use a harm itself because that's $700,000 against $2,000 target. So that's one problem. With repeaters, I've seen various different platforms used as repeaters, but Mavics themselves have been used as repeaters. The beauty of them as repeaters is that they're also cheap. And so if you can keep it relatively above your own position, so not really within range of anything kinetic on the other side, it's pretty hard to take them out. And if you locate the Mavic itself, it doesn't mean that you have located the pilot, because the communication between the drone along the line of sight happens to the Mavic. The Mavic is overhead, it's not the position itself. And then the Mavic talks to a much more nearby unit. So it's much harder for somebody who is located on the enemy side to know where the pilot is. Not impossible, but much more difficult. And sometimes they would use Orlans that fly over, collect signatures overhead, and then you would know both where the Mavic is and where the pilot is. So these are continually evolving approaches. The mothership approach, and I've seen some videos that look quite horrific of the Russians doing this, where they're able to take two positions in a row with virtually no casualties because they have deployed, they've deployed FPVs to figure out where the firing positions are, then they neutralize them, and it all happens without any infantry. And then infantry comes in and there's already almost empty positions on the other side. So this mothership approach both extends range, allows you to do much shorter follow-up time. So you don't need to fly the entire multi-minute trajectory. You can fly from this pre-base position. But the mothership itself is a point of vulnerability, so people will be targeting them. And these are larger, like octocopters usually, because they need to carry a lot of weight. It's not the same cheap Mavic. Mavic cannot carry FPVs that are comparable in size to it, so it has to be a bigger drone. It's much more noisy, and it's again it's an easier target. One thing I would also want to bring up, and this is relevant for kind of future planning, and this is a supply chain dependence on China. There's been a lot of talk through the entire year that China is a risk factor. And so far, I mean, up until very recently, none of these concerns about previously announced export controls have materialized. And people were able to fairly freely export components and fully assemble drones from
You're
China.
referring there to China announcing that they'll try to stop their drones from going to the zone of conflict via some export controls.
Yes. And they introduced multiple stages of that, from what I understand. Most recent one taking effect on September 1st. So we were able to buy drones post September 1st from mainland China and deliver them to Ukraine via a third country in Europe. We're starting to see that some of the carriers that previously provided the service, they've sent out notices in the last 2 weeks saying that anything that's fully assembled will be turned around. If it's shipped by air or by sea. They did not mention land. I wonder if it's a reference to, the land path to Russia. Maybe that's a nice exemption. I can't speak to that for sure, but on December 5th, I got the latest notice saying that we cannot take fully assembled drones. And I've started to get inbound inquiries from some of the government buyers asking for ways around this. So I'm sure there will be some way around this, but this threat is now being taken more seriously because there's now some specific action taken by China. And Ukraine is manufacturing some components. They're making frames. They're making these custom holders for payloads. They're making payloads themselves. Sometimes they modify radios, these ELRS or crossfire radios, to change the antenna or some other piece. But still, Ukraine is heavily dependent on China for key components. And the question is, can we maintain any kind of asymmetry or prevent Russia from getting asymmetry in this capability? Because whatever the trajectory of this thing is, if it becomes very successful, you want to make sure you have more of it than the enemy. And right now, there's no clarity on how we can possibly achieve this if Russia can import in much larger quantities. And historically, any of these developments that have been promising and that have occurred on the Ukrainian side, we've seen that Russia is slower on the R&D part, but faster in scaling. And they're also narrowing the number of SKUs of they're scaling. It's far fewer different types of drones. They're using government funds against a small number of distinct models that they've settled on, which allows them to get more mass, more quantity, and that's their advantage. They start slower, but then they move faster with scaling. So this is another thing that Ukraine needs to address, and it needs to know where it would get components in quantities that are material.
And the Russians themselves are really industrializing the production of some of these drones as well, right? So we're seeing thousands of drones being manufactured in Russia itself.
Yes. And besides the supply chain, the other bottleneck is training. These drones are much more difficult to operate than a Mavic 3. A quadcopter, where a lot of your piloting is automated, where you're basically operating a camera. You're just choosing what you are looking at. And that's the primary work you do as when you operate the Mavic. This is why it's so popular with consumer photography, wedding photo shoots, etc. Here you are looking from this camera, from this point of view of the drone itself, and you're piloting it, and it's very maneuverable, but it's much more difficult to train, and many people cannot do this because they have a physiological adverse reaction to being in that environment. It takes 3 to 4 weeks to train somebody. One of the things that we're trying to do now is scale training itself. Like in Zaporizhia, close to the front, we are funding a drone school that is able to churn out several dozen people per month. That will be a bottleneck. It costs about $500 to train one FPV pilot, and that's a worthwhile investment that needs to be made in parallel with getting the hardware, because oftentimes the efficacy between good and bad teams is 10x different. The fraction of drones that hits the target and the relative to the entire baseline of used FPVs is dramatically different depending on your experience. So it's important to not overlook the training of these groups that fly them.
So you said it takes $500?
It takes about $400 to $500 per pilot. And the reason why it's about one trainer can concurrently train about 6 trainees, and it takes 3 to 4 weeks, and they need to get some spare parts, and you need to pay the trainer, and you need to also get laptops to simulate these environments. So it's not that expensive, but it's the training cost per pilot that's comparable to the cost of one FPV drone.
So literally, some of our listeners that are hearing you right now can wire $500 to UkraineDefenseFund.org right now and create a FPV pilot in some weeks in Ukraine.
In 3 weeks.
Amazing. Mike, what else are you learning about the changing nature of the warfare, particularly when it comes to the use of various autonomous vehicles? We talked about, obviously, the aerial drones, but you're seeing also naval drones being used. There's discussion about ground-based vehicles as well. Kind of where do you see this heading?
So, I see that as always, we have a conversation here about sort of mass and precision, and increasingly we have sort of cheap precision and its proliferation at the front lines, and we're seeing drones starting to fill in for other roles, right? So this FPV drone costs $400 to $500 per one. That's still a lot cheaper than any even anti-tank guided missile or the kind of smallest, cheapest precision guided munition you could typically find on the front line. You have, a similar conversation maybe about naval drones. There's a fight that's sort of expanding in electromagnetic spectrum between systems that are being used to identify radars and electronic warfare systems and versus sort of electronic support for targeting. But, where I see it going is a perpetual conversation, right? Precision is a counter for mass, but I've consistently not seen it as a substitute for mass. You still need ground forces, right? You still need some types of armored fighting vehicles. You still need fires, you need fire support, and you need the decisive fire's advantage. And maybe that's where we'll end up. Maybe we will end up with these systems becoming, to some extent, an actual substitute for mass in some roles. I don't know if that's the case, but I still hold to these views. I see drones starting to fill in for example, for counterbattery fire, which is really interesting because both sides can no longer perform volume of fire missions like they used to. The Russian military had to adapt. It basically ran low on artillery ammunition. It could no longer concentrate artillery the way it used to. And instead, you had dispersed artillery, largely firing from fixed positions or hot points that are not very far from cold point where the artillery piece is based. And both sides primarily worrying about counterbattery fire from a drone. On the Ukrainian side, the real problem is the Russian Lancet. And you see that Ukrainian artillery pieces all live in these counter Lancet homes. They have these nets and they have these metal sort of grates, counter drone grates that are welded on top of the artillery pieces. And they're far less worried about actual counter battery fire from artillery, and they're much more worried about FPVs and Lancet drones, right? And maybe at best case, the thing that concerns them about artillery is cross support. An Orlan 30 might come in with a laser illuminator, and they might get hit by a Russian precision guided artillery shell, which is far less common, but they're making much more of. So one thing I'm noticing is that as a conventional war begins to consume the resources that both sides had, They're not able to replace artillery ammunition, right? They're having issues with whether it's artillery barrels or it's ammo or it's barrels or it's ammo. They're constantly trying to run on both treadmills at the same time. You're seeing drones start to fill in, and you start to see doctrinal adaptation where both sides now increasingly rely, let's say, on drones for counter-battery fire or for certain types of fire support missions or for overwatch. And then you see that driving force structure changes Andrey and Rob discussed. If you look at the actual assault force relative to the drone support force, like you see there's quite a few people involved in the drone missions. Overwatch, strike, retransmission relative to the actual number of ground troops involved in the attack. Right? And I think that's going to drive changes in organizational capacity and force structure as well. So these tend to be the things I look for to see, if tactics are evolving, to seeing changes to this other way of these other elements of the military.
Let me just ask you about the naval piece of this, because a lot has been made about these strikes on the Black Sea Fleet. Now, some of them have been missile strikes with Storm Shadow and the like, not necessarily naval drone strikes, but some of them have been. So do you see that changing the nature of naval warfare?
Honestly, not really. I mean, when I look at a drone, I usually ask myself, what is it? Is it a remotely operated aircraft? Is it a missile? Or is it, a long-range torpedo that's operated or something like that? What is the role it's filling? And, the Russian Navy, the Black Sea Fleet, had a big problem early on with coastal defense cruise missile battery that Ukraine embraced. So it had a big problem with supporting its force on Snake Island and then trying to enforce a blockade, right? The drones gave Ukraine a pretty good asymmetric capability in the absence of something that could deliver a long-range anti-ship missile or a torpedo or something of that type, or the ability to, let's say, offensively mine, right? So it's made it for a pretty good, asymmetric placeholder. And it gave it a long-range strike ability against infrastructure like the Kerch Strait Bridge, or Port of Novorossiysk, where an attempt was made. All right. So it's interesting that the technology is going to move in this direction. It's going to give lots of other countries who don't necessarily have those higher end conventional capabilities the ability to attain some similar effects or some parity of effects with it. I think that's quite fascinating. I don't know if it's going to change the character of war to be much more remotely operated autonomous, but it's clear that things are heading in that direction. All right. That said, the case of what's happening in the Black Sea, it's a very successful battle for Ukraine to be able to open up a corridor for export of grain and steel and to essentially challenge and successfully challenge the Russian blockade and being this insurance blockade. Okay, that said, this battle is far from over, right? And the Black Sea Fleet was forced to displace more to the port of Novorossiysk, not really because of the drone threat, but because of the long-range strike cruise missile threat, right? If you look at the means that most affected the Black Sea Fleet, it's actually still pretty traditional and conventional means. And it's not clear how much of the Black Sea Fleet, probably the cruise missile shooters, displaced in Novorossiysk, while other elements of it are still in Sevastopol. I don't know, but it's worth having Rob and Andrey chime in on this, because looking at the naval warfare aspect of it, I think it's really fascinating what drones have allowed Ukraine to do. And they've allowed Ukraine to establish a degree of sea denial, and maybe in some parts of the northwest corner of the Black Sea, even sea control. It's very much worth studying. But there's more that we would have to know about what really happened there and how it played out, if that makes any sense, right? This is one aspect, and we're a big challenge. Rob and I do not have the ability to go out into the Black Sea and take a look at what's going on and quite interview people. I mean, if Rob is shaking his head right now, like, we could get a boat, Rob is a former Marine, and I'm former director of Center for Naval Analysis Program. So together we could probably make something happen there. That's a thought.
I love boats too.
But it might be unwise.
I want to join you on the next trip when it gets a little bit warmer. But by the way, we should say that it's great that Ukraine is able to get some ships out of the port of Odessa, but the volume of ships that have left is numbering a few hundreds, right? It's a small fraction of what they were able to do when they had the deal with Russia before Russia tore it apart in July. So this is still not really compensating for what they need and want to do in terms of all their exports. It's still very much under threat. But Rob, let's bring you in on the naval piece.
Naval side, I still have some questions about how certain events happens. I think, one thing to keep in mind is that the Russian military during this war has waited to adapt, right? They've kind of done their thing, and they've waited until Ukraine has punched them in the face until they actually adapt. right? And sometimes it takes them to get multiple punches in the face before they actually do something, right? So we knew when the HIMARS arrived, right? They was telegraphed months in advance that Ukraine was getting HIMARS. Russia took almost no steps to prevent this, and then all of their ammunition depots within HIMARS range started getting blown up, and they're like, "Oh, who could have thought this is going to happen?" Right?
And the same thing with ATACMS. It was advertised for months, and they didn't adapt until they got hit, right?
Exactly. Same with ATACMS. And again, the Berjansk airfield was the obvious target for the M39. And then lo and behold, exactly what happened is what you expected. And of course, they adapted to that. They started using FARPs, but they take time. So, I mean, the Snake Island thing was an interesting case study in this, in that when Ukraine started receiving, harpoons, anti-ship missiles, they started receiving artillery like Caesars that had range that could hit the island from the mainlands. Obviously, we knew the Bodana or Ukrainian artillery piece also support, but we once we knew the Caesar was coming, all right, that Russia should have known they have the range to hit this island, and that means holding this island is going to become untenable at some point. Well, they didn't respond to that. They just waited until the island started getting hit by artillery. They started losing valuable equipment and men on the islands. And then when they tried to, going back and forth to the islands, they're getting destroyed by either TB2s or by harpoons or whatever, right? And so again, this is something that should have been foreseeable, but they waited until kind of Ukraine, hit them in the face until they actually adapted. And so I think across this war, the Russian Navy has been very kind of reactive. They've waited. They haven't kind of preempted kind of, certain things. And then Ukraine has some asymmetry, ways of kind of dealing with this or threats to kind of create for Russia. So I think they've adapted to some extent. As Mike said, I think there's a lot of questions or uncertainty that I have. I don't know everything they've done or exactly how the naval fight is gone. But certainly they made a number of kind of, obvious mistakes in that regard. The other thing I'd say about modern warfare, and this is something that Andrey mentioned before, the cost-benefit side is one of the big factors here. One thing with Orlan UAVs, which are not very capable, they're not that impressive, right? They don't have great capabilities, but they're very cheap to make. And so if Russia could put up Orlan 10s all day, and for the Ukraine, it's a question of, does it make sense to use man pads to fire and knock down Orlan UAV? And typically it doesn't make sense, right? And so it means that Russia has a, relatively persistent ISR capability. Okay, the footage isn't great, but, it's enough to be a kind of problem. And that's true for a lot of weapons. That's true for a lot of systems. And my view, the big I think technological development in this war is the role of commercial systems. Right, military systems are what they are, but there are a lot of cheap commercial systems that were not available 10 years ago that you can now buy off the shelf. You can buy from Amazon that have a very useful military role, whether it's FPVs, Mavics. You can buy night vision goggles much cheaper than they used to be. Thermal optics much cheaper than they used to be. A lot of these things, it was only in the domain of militaries maybe 15, 20 years ago. And I think in a large part, I think actually it's a result of OIF and OEF, because once the U.S. military, once it became a demand for some of these kind of commercial systems, the prices started going down.
So explain OIF and OEF for the audience.
So the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. Yeah. And over time, U.S. A lot of our kind of commercial companies developed that started producing, equipment for soldiers or other kinds of systems. I think China kind of jumped in at that. Like, Holosun is this kind of famous Chinese optic manufacturer for weapons optics, much cheaper than Western designs, but it's kind of good enough usually. And a lot of Russian soldiers use them, right? And that was not something that was possible 15, 20 years ago to buy these things commercially. Now it is, right? Now crowdfunding, and Andrey knows this better than we do, crowdfunding plays a really important role in wars. It would not have been as effective 20 years ago because there weren't available options to buy that could have this kind of military role. So I think that's been the significant development. And of course, that means it's not just, nation states. It's obviously terrorist groups or paramilitary groups that can use these things and use them effectively. The barriers for entry are much lower than they used to be. And everyone's watching what's going on in Ukraine, and everyone is going to draw lessons from this. And so, my concern is that we, like a U.S. military, NATO military, are not responding fast enough as other countries are about these developments. And look, China produced a lot of these UAVs. They produced a lot of these FPVs. They're learning from what Russia's doing too. If the U.S. military gets to a fight with China at some point, why would we not assume that China will have these things developed and can produce them and use them at scale, right? They likely can. So I think that's one place to look at when we go forward. And also about the weapon systems they develop. And like in another one, the anecdote, I know a company that's developing long-range kamikaze UAVs. The price of them is roughly what a Javelin missile costs. but the range is 100 times more than what a javelin range, or 50 times more than the range of a javelin in the same kind of warhead. And so that's where we're getting back into it and say, hey, we have all these weapon systems. The price point is not necessarily where it could be for future weapon systems, but a lot of this comes to the right demand signals, right? Western governments have to come up and say, hey, these are things we need. This is the price point we expect you to build this at, because we know other competitors can do this. And, I think we look at Ukraine. If Ukraine is making FPVs that can resist EW, that can penetrate tanks, it only costs maybe $1,000 when you put everything into maybe software, other things. Some important questions we should be asking about: why does a Javelin missile cost $80,000, $100,000, right? Other things of that nature. And I think we should be looking at that. We should be asking those kind of questions.
Well, and unfortunately, the U.S. military is not known for being able to buy cheap stuff or do rapid procurement, right? But Mike, you wanted to jump in here.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that. Wait, 2 points. First, the thing about the FPV, though, is that it does right now in this war need to be cheap at $400 to $500. That allows it to be employed in that way. You can make it a bit more expensive with these other systems that are going to be added to it, let's say. But if you start adding a thermal imager to it, if you start adding certain other chips and things that people want to be able to terminal guidance, the real challenge is managing the price point, because if the thing costs several $1,000s, it can't be used as expendably as disposably. That's the rough cost of whether it's the better pound-for-pound system in the war, like a Mavic 3T with a thermal imager. So once you start getting to several thousand, it gets harder and harder to supply them to units. It's still doable. It's just harder. And you have to keep in mind that the Ukrainian units at the front need something that they can use like this and be able to afford to lose it. You're talking about the U.S. military is very apt, Dmitri. For the U.S. military, the system is too cheap. They would need Raytheon to make it like 20 times the price and in several states for it to be procurable. I'm just joking. But the reality is that we could very easily benefit from the experience in Ukraine. We have so many companies testing systems in Ukraine, but they have no contracts to develop those systems, either for us or for the Ukrainians, even though we are spending plenty of money. And, a lot of money we spend never leaves the United States. Like, it doesn't actually go to Ukraine. It's to substitute for systems we send Ukraine. So I just worry that we neither have an expansive lessons learned, let's say, program or initiative, nor do we have a lot of contracts for people to develop these systems there. Nor, I think, are we best positioned in terms of training and adaptation based on what's happening in Ukraine and where the, if not the character of war, at least tactics and technology are going. And tactics and technology always have to be forward-looking. Strategy can look backwards, but tactics and technology are forward-looking. They're intertwined.
And let me, if you jump in real quick, Mike and I are going to mention our op-ed, but one of the important things we have to do going forward, and is, the solution he mentioned is in an interview with economists, is that we can out-innovate Russia, but we're not out-innovating Russia right now. Ukraine out-innovates Russia, but they do it at a small scale, and they need additional support to kind of do that scale. When FPVs are a good example, Ukraine started using FPVs well before Russia did, then Russia caught up, and now they have a quantitative advantage on most parts of the front. We have a lot of innovation capability, capacity in the West, but our companies are not, the demand signal is not there yet. And so we have to consider, at least Western companies or Western governments, signing contracts with Western companies to provide equipment that Ukraine needs, right? Specific things like maybe kamikaze drones, maybe EW, things that Zelensky mentioned. Here are things that we need to kind of break out of the stalemate as he framed it. And right now, it's not happening as it needs to. Right now, a lot of Western companies kind of test things at on their own dime, but not we're talking about dozens of systems as opposed to like thousands, tens of thousands. And so I think important division of labor has to come up where I think Ukraine can produce a lot of FPVs themselves if they have the funding to do so. And I think a lot of countries, like Western countries that maybe don't have the ammo to provide Ukraine, could probably fund production FPVs in Ukraine themselves or EW or things of that nature. And
or the explosive for them, right? Those RPG rounds and other things.
That too. And then we could look at saying, okay, here's some things that only maybe Western defense companies can do by producing longer range, maybe like 100 operational level kind of kamikaze drones that might be useful that can operate in GPS defined environments. Not the very long range ones. Ukraine are making them themselves. I think they can do that themselves, but the operational military style ones that can hit a target maybe 100 kilometers, 150 kilometers, command posts, electronic warfare systems, army kind of level assets, things of that nature. I think we could do that. We have companies that can do that. They can do it at scale, but they have to have the contract signed. And ideally, we have to have another customer. Because if Western companies are going to scale production capacity, they have opportunities cost too. They have to know there's going to be a long-term contract customer for this. So ideally, it's a question of us, like a U.S. military, NATO military, or other militaries like Taiwan or someone else, finding weapons that we need, they need, that Ukraine also needs, that we can test and develop in Ukraine. It can scale production in Ukraine. It would still be useful for us to produce in the long term. And I think a lot of these things are there. I just think we're too slow to kind of conceptualize what we need, what we're seeing from this war, and then sign those contracts now, because now we can help out Ukraine a lot. And look, the EW side, as I said before, we're going to face FPVs, Mavics, other things in any war we fight in the future. We have an incentive to develop, test EW systems now, get the Ukrainians to figure out how to use them best, and then learn from this experience so that we are ready for our next war. And if we don't do that, we're going to learn lessons the hard way. And it's better to learn them the easy way and also save Ukrainian lives while doing so.
No, I mean, both of you, Mike and Rob, you're making such a great point, because the debate right now around funding Ukraine is all about obviously helping Ukraine. And there's not enough discussion about how that can help us, not just strategically in terms of helping Ukraine survive and beating back Russia, but also in terms of being the battlefield and the testing ground for a lot of these new innovations, helping our own militaries learn from them, develop new tactics, new systems that we can use in our own fights should we have them in the future. But Andrey, let me give you last word, because we heard from you on this podcast just now that $500 donation to Ukraine Defense Fund, ukrainedefense.org, will buy you an FPV operator. Talk a little bit more about what other things you're doing and how far those dollars that go to your organization, to your charity, would go in terms of producing actual effects on the battlefield.
Let me first give you a couple of more interesting examples on the FPV side, and I'll answer your question. There are a couple of new applications that I'm seeing that might scale and might have more relevance for operations outside of Ukraine, and therefore a stronger incentive for Western companies to engage. One is that an FPV drone can in fact kill somebody just by impact. You don't need to have a payload to kill somebody. It has, if you remember this 2022 hit on al-Zawahiri in Kabul, where R96 Hellfire hit him through a balcony window, and didn't really have much collateral damage because it has razor sharp, blades, and just killed the guy by impact. An FPV drone has propellers that rotate at 20,000 RPM, and this thing flies at 120 miles an hour. So if that hits you, you can't outrun it, and you basically become, ground meat after that. So the very sound of an FPV now causes panic among the folks who hear it. A lot of their mortar fires used to just suppress enemy action. You're not trying to hit the target; they're just trying to create the impression that they are being deterred in some form. And if you're moving your mortars, it takes 5 to 7 shots to even settle the plate. So what an FPV can do is to do a round trip that doesn't result in the loss of a vehicle, but still has a suppression effect. And it can do a targeted hit with almost no collateral damage on specific targets. When you look at the overall spend, if you believe in the official casualty numbers on the Russian side, it's, let's say, 1 to 200,000 killed in action. If you combine all the spend that has occurred by Ukrainian allies on this war, it's approaching 80 to 90 billion dollars. That means that the spend per person, again in the crude terms, is $300,000 per killed in action on the enemy side. So in some sense, it's
less if you count the wounded, but yes.
Yes, but again, if you assume it's 100,000, if only 100,000 people were killed on the Russian side, it's a lower estimate. That means that 900,000 are expended roughly per 1 KA. Remember, the FPV drone without the payload costs several $100s, so it's 1,000 times cheaper. So in some sense, if you're able to take out infantry one by one, that's dramatically cheaper than using these combined arms operations. So whenever you can reach them, which again is not enormous. These FPV drones are very, very tactical. They can't fly very far, even though there are attempts to move to from quadcopters to fixed wing FPVs that would have longer range and therefore hit targets that are farther away. But still, the point is that because this is a war of attrition now and resources matter so much, Ukraine has to have the capabilities that are basically generics of US version of US brand name systems. So this is an example of a generic to an R9X Hellfire that costs, we don't know exactly how much it costs, but it's probably around $100,000 based on comparables. So you're having, 2 order of magnitude, 3 order of magnitude difference in pricing if you are moving to this platform for use cases where it does apply. Of course, it cannot do the same things that Hellfire in terms of range, etc. But nevertheless, it's a very important thing to consider that this range of capabilities can make the same dollar go way farther, and because of that, it gives Ukraine a chance in a scenario where Russia has 10x more to spend on the war effort than Ukraine can spend domestically because of the GDP difference. So that's just to wrap this FPV discussion. I think it's again, I agree with Mike and Rob that this is not a replacement for things, but it's a major complement, and it's incredibly important to stay ahead of the other side, on multiple dimensions. Now to the work that UDF is doing. So Ukraine Defense Fund is a US-based 501c3 organization. We are trying to work very closely with the Ukrainian General Staff on identifying the needs. And we're trying to understand what can move the needle the most. And right now, it's very clear that training is one of the huge bottlenecks. This has been cited by various analysts here and among the other NATO allies,
including the two we have on the podcast right now.
Yeah, the two prominent analysts who we have on this podcast have emphasized this repeatedly. We want to make sure that we can provide quality training to people who operate these systems, both FPVs and other types of drones, including fixed-wing aircraft. We are funding several efforts around this, both the trainers and the facilities and some of the spare parts. We're focusing on a number of things that are high leverage incidental expenses for these organizations. Oftentimes they have good ideas for which they don't have headcount, they don't have budget, and we're just trying to pick up the slack. We're moving away from buying disposable assets because in some sense we can never have the scale that any nation state would have. So we're trying to find very specific bottlenecks and fill them. All of our overhead is funded by an anonymous centi-billionaire, so somebody who has covered all of our travel costs, etc. So we spend all of the donations that we receive on direct program expenses in Ukraine. And anyone who is interested in facilitating this can go to ukrainedefensefund.org and make a contribution through whatever channel they find more convenient.
Terrific podcast, terrific cause. What you're doing, Andrey. I hope people that are listening can contribute. Again, ukrainedefensefund.org. Thanks again, guys. Always a fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
Хто тобі радий?